Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. The video that you're about to see, it's just some thoughts on rFactor. Yes, rFactor 1, my start in PC sim racing. I am keenly aware that we do have some frame rate issues in this video, so the onboard driving scenes where I'm commentating and driving, they're going to appear to be a bit jumpy. This is due to hardware limitations. My newfangled hardware just can't really 100% integrate itself with rFactor 1 video capture any longer. So I do hope that you will bear with me through this video because I do think that, well, maybe there's some value in it anyway. Without further ado, to the video. Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Welcome to rFactor. Welcome to the cockpit of the BMW Sauber F106. Welcome to a trip down memory lane. I have no point in making this video here today. What I wanted to do, though, is just reminisce a little bit about how I came to know sim racing. The first proper sim that I ever played was rFactor. rFactor, of course, came out courtesy of Image Space Incorporated, otherwise known as ISI, all the way back in 2005. Up to that point, I had really never played racing games on the PC because up to that point I never really had a PC that was capable of running things like that. Of course, I know about games like GTR and Grand Prix Legends, and then of course the Papyrus indie games and NASCAR games before that, but that was all a little bit before my time. My journey into sim racing began on consoles, namely the PlayStation, starting all the way back now in 1999. It is pretty crazy to think that I have been doing this in some form for nearly 20 years, but it is true. The first realistic racing game that I ever owned was Gran Turismo 2 on the PlayStation. Yes, the original PlayStation, which by this point I'm well aware that predates the birth dates of many of you in my audience. I'm quite aware of that, and I am dating myself here. But that was my introduction to motorsport. That was my introduction to how cars work, how you've got to treat them, how they behave, and how they will bite you, and how they will reward you when you do get everything hooked up correctly. rFactor. I was introduced to rFactor via a demo disc that came with our new computer when we bought it in about 2005, 2006, thereabouts. I remember it was my freshman year of high school, so that would put us at the midpoint of 2006. So that was my introduction to rFactor, and it was my introduction to really top class PC sim racing. Like I said, I had never driven a PC sim before. At the time, I had a steering wheel controller that I had been using for Gran Turismo. The Gran Turismo series, of course, continued through PlayStation 2 and then later PlayStation 3 and now PS4. So I'd been using a steering wheel controller with Gran Turismo 3, Gran Turismo 4, and Gran Turismo 5 had not come out yet. So I had a steering wheel, I plugged it into the computer, and I started to play. What did I start to play with on that demo disc? Well, one of the cars available on that demo disc was this, the BMW Sauber F106. Now, that particular car is not the one that we're in today. That F106 that shipped with the initial demo discs of rFactor, that one has apparently been lost to history. I've not been able to find that one ever again anywhere on the internet. The F107 shipped with the full-on 1.0 and above copies of rFactor that eventually went to market. However, the F106 was lost forever. This one, however, comes to us courtesy of the legendary CTDP mod. CTDP, the car and track development project that was ongoing throughout the mid 2000s into the 2010s for rFactor 1, they made two absolutely world-class mods of the 2005 and 2006 Formula One seasons, and this car here, the BMW, is coming to us from their F106 mod. Brilliant work by those guys. I don't know if that group still exists in any regard today, but their work survives, and I have to say, given the limited resources they had by modern standards, they did an absolutely fantastic job no holds barred. Anyway, my first experiences with PC sim racing, they happened courtesy of this car and also courtesy of this track. We are at the Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit. Here in rFactor, it is labeled as the European Grand Prix. That's how old this game is. But it was the only circuit that I could drive on, the only road course really, and of course this BMW was the only open wheeler that I could drive. So this is where I first started to cut my teeth with how to drive an open wheeler. We turn the ignition on and the car comes to life here. Obviously the engine is stopped, but everything is just rearing and ready to go. We've got a little bit of temperature in the tires. I guess they're still in the blankets a little bit, but we've got to get everything up to temperature and we've got to go out. Get the engine fired. There we go. The engine is up. We'll get the speed limiter on, first gear, and we'll pull out of the pits here at the Nürburgring in the F106. The sounds here are CTDP original. I've not modified them in any way. The copy of rFactor that I'm using is actually the Steam version now, so perhaps in some regards under the skin it's a little bit different to what I initially had on that demo disc, but for the most part all the bones are the same. Just getting up to temperature here a little bit, being very gentle with the car. My first couple of runs in an open wheeler on a PC, I'm pretty sure I initially did them with a keyboard just to get a feel for how the game worked and all of that. They were disastrous, absolutely. Despite me having become quite adept at Gran Turismo by that time and getting all the licenses and winning all the championships, PC sim racing was and still is today a completely different kettle of fish. So the learning curve that I found myself beginning to climb was absolutely massive, and it was the first time that I had ever encountered anything like that. However, with the rudimentary computer and steering wheel equipment that I had back then, and obviously continuing my studies through high school, I did begin to climb that learning curve, and ultimately it leads us to where we are today with Ferrari Man 601, the videos I'm making, and if it's really worth anything, whatever skill I'm able to show, this is really where it all started. This track, this car, in this sim. Start to give it a little beans here on this lap. Gears feel a little bit long. Brakes are still kind of cold in the core temperature. We do have to get a little bit more heat in those tires. We're still in understeer city right now. It might come to us a little bit, or it might not. We shall see. Lots of traction control running, of course, 2006 regulations. Definitely not able to attack it yet. Need a bit more temperature in those tires. Where are those tires, by the way? Getting there. Temperatures are displayed in Fahrenheit. When these tires really get into their working range, they'll be around 200 degrees Fahrenheit or so. So we still got a little bit of ways to go. Just all of the sounds and the sights and the sensations that I used to get all those years ago, they are coming back, believe it or not. For the record, I believe this is the first rFactor video that I have made in about 4 years. Of course, getting a new computer and changing my encoder and my video export formats. Gone are the days of 360p and 30 frames per second. Now we're doing 4K and 60 frames per second with so much more resolution. 142.19. So much more resolution than this game was ever capable of outputting. But what really mattered back then, and still matters today, is the driving experience that you got. The physics in this thing were second to none back in 2005, and even today, all these years later, in 2018, they're still very respectable. They are still, in many regards, the benchmark to what sim racing titles aspire to achieve. Sure, rFactor 2, obviously the successor to this game, has improved a lot on those physics. However, the graphics are still very reminiscent of this. And even later titles like iRacing came on the scene first off in 2008. They looked at something like rFactor as their benchmark in the beginning, and they've only improved on it from there. Even titles like the Codemasters F1 series, and then of course Assetto Corsa. They looked at this and they said, hey, this is really cool. Let's not change anything, but let's make it better. The car is definitely understeery. Don't have the confidence really to attack the corners, but that's okay. I mentioned this is my first rFactor video in 4 years. This is essentially my first run in rFactor in about as long as well.
Alright, that was a 140.19.
We're well off the pace here. We're about 8 seconds off the ultimate pace of what this car could do on a good day. I don't care. This is all about just getting back into this. One thing that I, of course, could not do at the time when this was the gold standard, I wasn't really able to do my commentated videos. I was not ever really able to do reviews. I did do a couple of reviews later on as rFactor started to sing its swan song. I remember the first ever commentated review I did was of the DRM revival mod for rFactor, which of course we just got in Assetto Corsa. I also remember doing a review of the WCP F1 2014 mod, or at least a demo version thereof. So some of the techniques that you still see me using today on YouTube, they were also figured out here in rFactor. But nowadays, with the advent of Steam, I don't have to find the old CD-ROMs anymore. Just go up onto Steam, pick it up, get it downloaded. I remember back in the day the file sizes seemed absolutely enormous. Now, the total download size for this was about 8 gigabytes, something like that. I remember that was half of my hard drive back in 2006. Now, barely notice it.
Alright, that was a 139.08.
We are getting faster. Not much, but we are getting there. I'd have to do a lot of setup work on this car to get it to where I know it can be now. But back in 06, when I was just getting my first taste of all of this, I'd be thrilled to be doing 139s around here. Coming back into a car like this, in a sim like this, at a track like this, I really can appreciate, just speaking for myself, how much my skills have evolved. I don't necessarily want to say that they've improved, because the only thing that's different between then and now is experience, and of course the different technologies that we now have. But it's really, really cool to be back in here and to have your memory jogged in terms of all the things that you remember that you used to do back then, and you just think of things like that and you say, no, why would I ever think to do that? Why would I ever think to brake purely in a straight line and then turn and do things like that? You just don't do it anymore. It's a fluid motion. Of course, I intuitively understand things like that today, but back then, absolutely impossible for me.
Alright, that was a 139.76.
Just the little things about this sim, the way that the head movement is in cockpit view, and the really high frequency juddery vibrations that you get over the bumps and over the curves. You see the monocoque moving all around you. No sim does that today. It's way too exaggerated, but back then it added so much to the feeling of intensity and the beginnings of immersion, I suppose. The way the instruments in the cockpit, the way that they actually work, that was brand new to me as well. The fact that you've got a steering wheel that you can read and it gives you useful information with shift lights and a lap counter and a gear position indicator and your speed. It's all so cool back then, and it's still cool today when we think about it. The biggest novelty for me back then was just the fact that I could drive a car like this from the cockpit. I had also played the Formula One video games that were available in the United States. F1 2001 by Studio Liverpool and Sony, of course the EA Formula One games as well. F1 2001, F1 2002 I believe also we had. But you couldn't really drive those from the cockpit so much. I mean, the Studio Liverpool game not at all. The EA version somewhat, but it was really basic.
138.96.
But this, with a fully kitted out cockpit with a steering wheel that moves and has an interactive display on it, it was just so much different, so much to take in, and it really, really was one of the things that just made me feel, yeah, I want to do more of this. In terms of the mod itself, you know, if I saw something like this today coming out for Assetto Corsa, I would say, wow, these guys didn't try at all. But to look at it in the context of what it was back in 2006, I've got a lot of information coming to me. The force feedback feels okay. I do have to keep adjusting the settings to get it where I really would like it, but it feels good enough. I feel the bumps, I feel the curb effects very nicely. Visibility's pretty good from the cockpit, despite that really strange-looking screen in front of it. Couldn't really do transparent textures very well in these days, but they tried their best. The sounds are good enough as well, considering how old this is. Tires feel fine. Brakes feel great. I mean, that's a lot of stopping power. It really is. Ultimately, it was a good effort then, and it's a good effort now.
That was a 138.49.
Outbraking myself a little bit, that's okay. Gotta remember the gearbox physics here. In rFactor, seamless shift wasn't a thing. There's a noticeable gap in drive between the gears. The downshifts, there is auto blip, but you gotta be careful. You can lock up the rear axle if you're not careful. You do get brake fade when the temperatures get really high. We've got that under control here. Of course, you have non-linear tire wear curves and things like that, so all that's still pretty modern, believe it or not. The other thing that was missing from rFactor, weather. No real weather system, no real dynamic racing line, no debris or dust or marbles on the track surface, none of that. But for its era, for what it was utterly groundbreaking. And I do have to say, it is very, very cool to be back in here. We'll pull into the pits. Nail it up to the limiter line. There it is. So very, very cool to be back here in rFactor, the original rFactor, where all of this began for me. There it is. That modeling work, for its era, it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, even today, the amount of detail on this, you can definitely tell it looks dated, but it's not too bad, all things considered. I mean, of course, they had the limitations with the graphics hardware they had. You don't really see smooth lines in curved surfaces, these little winglets, for example. You can see the pixelation in them even from quite some distance, but for the most part, it really still looks good enough. I mean, there are other things like the masking layer that's over the rear rain light here. It's just a masking layer. We're not seeing illumination. It's not its own light source. There's no bloom effect or anything. And of course, you can see it from, in front of the rain light. But all of that aside, it really is a testament, I think, to not only where I've come from just personally in my sim racing career, but really where the technology has come from. Because this is where a lot of us started. For people my age, certainly this is where we started. But even for some maybe newer comers to sim racing, if you can get a copy of rFactor for cheap, it's $25 US on Steam right now. So certainly not going to break your budget. Take a look at it. Give it a whirl if you've got a wheel and pedals. You don't even need great equipment, you just need something to get yourself started. There are still hundreds of mods available right now for free for this game, and believe it or not, there are still some modders that are active in rFactor. It is so cool. All of the modding ability that came in with Grand Prix Legends and GTR, that ported its way into rFactor, and it's continued all the way up through Assetto Corsa today and Project Cars as well. I'm sure has some modders out there who are doing things with all kinds of parameters and different cars and tracks. So really, we have rFactor to thank for a lot. Not only do I personally, but the sim racing community in general has a lot to thank rFactor for, because all the websites that were up in 05, 06 for rFactor, I'm talking about rFactor Central, they're still up. Yeah, a lot of the links nowadays are broken, but the websites are still there. The forums are still there. Now websites like Race Department, they've ported over a lot of those resources and they've made them available once again. CTDP, the guys who developed this mod, their website's still up. I don't know if they attend to it anymore, but it's still there. So, I mean, everything. Even the guys like ASR, for example, guess where they started modding things? rFactor. They put together a brilliant 1991 mod, Formula One season mod for rFactor. It's still available. And quite a lot of the know-how that they learned from that, they're bringing into their Assetto Corsa cars today. So definitely, we've got a lot to thank rFactor for. It's still, for me, it is the ultimate granddaddy of all the sims that are out there, and it's where I first started with sim racing, and I'm really happy that we can still run it, and I'm really happy that I can bring it back to my YouTube channel now, like I said, about 4 years after it made its last appearance. So definitely very, very cool. I will leave you with a couple of hot laps from this BMW Sauber F106 here at the Nürburgring. They're not going to be particularly quick because I'm not really going to do any more setup work with this car, but just think about it. Think about what you're seeing right now and think about what you see in my Assetto Corsa videos, and really just be appreciative and somewhat awestruck by the progression of consumer grade sim racing technology today. Thank you all very, very much for watching. FerrariMan601 saying thanks, and we will see you soon.